Chapter 15, Privacy and Alienation. One of the questions I did not ask at the end of my training was why it was important to keep from others the knowledge of my animal that helps. Why could I not share that? Why should others not know? An answer to that unasked question came some years later when I spent a few weeks with other so-called primitive people on a small Pacific island. People living in a close-knit group where everyone is family, although not necessarily related by blood, have no privacy. What privacy there can be must be inside one's heart. In such a society, people cherish immaterial things that are uniquely personal. For some, one's true name is private. The name one uses in public is just a social convenience. One's real name nobody knows, except perhaps the priest. Nothing is more cherished and sometimes private than what Native Americans call one's totem animal, the animal that helps of the Signoi. Westerners have written about the fear Native peoples had of being photographed. Explorers explain that natives were afraid that with the photographic likeness, the soul of the person was stolen. Perhaps taking a picture is an invasion of privacy. Our society thinks of privacy differently. To us, privacy is space, fenced space. Americans dream of owning their own home on their own piece of land, surrounded by a white picket fence. Well, today perhaps an electrified steel link fence with a sophisticated alarm system. We have created legal fences too. Boundaries set in law, so far and no further. You cannot say this and that to me. You cannot do this and that in my presence. And woe to those who trespass our many boundaries. Today, one is likely to be shot. In an American home, people have their own bedrooms, their own beds, and if they are rich enough, their own bathrooms, and even their own cars. Even our bodies have boundaries. We do not touch each other, except because touching means something sexual is intended. We have more private physical space than anyone in the history of mankind has had. Yet, we are also more alienated from each other, as we are from the earth that nurtures us, than anyone in the history of mankind. Today, I no longer wonder at the things I say when I let my inner knowing speak. My mouth may surprise me, but when, after I say the words, their meaning penetrates my consciousness admits that my mouth spoke truth. The knowing I learned is not the same as consciousness. It is far deeper. I have found that sometimes I know something that I cannot possibly know, much as Amid knew about the ocean. That kind of knowing does not fit into the Western view of what is real. Scientists need to measure, dissect, analyze, and prove harmless before they can accept that a plant has valuable properties, for instance. And, of course, the properties of the plant have to fit into current theories of Western medicine. Anthropologists and other scientists have occasionally and with great reluctance studied herbs that people in the out-of-the-way places have used for millennia, forgetting that a healing system is just that, a system. Pharmaceuticals cannot be considered separate from the healing system in which they were developed. Western scientists seem surprised when they find that some herbs and potions work. The next step, then, is always to an elaborate high-tech chemical analysis of the herb to identify the active principle. The active principle is then recreated from chemicals so that it can be commercially produced without the many, quote, impurities of the original plant material. Although now nobody will ever know whether perhaps one or more of those impurities play an important part in the effectiveness of the natural herb. The sap of the leaves of aloe vera, for instance, soothe and even heal burn with amazing efficacy, as anyone who has used it will tell you. There is little profit in selling aloe vera plants, however. But when scientists identified what they named allantoin, the active principle, a product could be manufactured and sold commercially. The explanation Western scientists give for how people all over the world discover the healing qualities of plants without the benefit of our sophisticated science is always the same: trial and error, as if primitive people tried this tree bark or that tree leaf, or perhaps experimented cooking it and then eating it raw, shredding it, baking it, until in the end they kept what worked. In reality, the preparation of many native foods and medicines is often so complicated, requiring so many steps, that it is hard to imagine how people would use trial and error to learn what is good and safe to eat, or which herbs prepared which ways prove to be medicinal. How would people discover through trial and error that kukuri, the quick and deadly poison that can be applied to blow darts or arrows, must be prepared by collecting the sap of a plant and cooking it down into a thick paste, being careful the whole time not to touch it with their hands? Touching often means ingesting for those who do not frequently wash their hands. In some parts of the world, the staple food is made from a root vegetable, cassava in South America, that contains very toxic prussic acid. The root must be washed, peeled, shredded, soaked in water, wrung out using great pressure, washed and squeezed again, dried to a powder, then mixed with water and cooked. All those steps through trial and error? Oh, one wonders how many thousands of people must have died from trying the wrong thing or the wrong sequence of steps in the preparation. Did people discover edible mushrooms through trial and error? All through history, there have been people who knew with an inner knowing. Once, while walking up a steep and very narrow trail that goes into the Hapakapi Valley on the Isle of Kauai, I had an almost disabling sinus headache. Each step pounded in my head. As I trudged up the steep trail, I looked up and saw a plant I did not know, maybe 20 feet above me on the side of the cliff. As I looked at the plant, I knew what it would feel like: hairy but not stinging; what it would smell like: aromatic. And I knew that if I could get even one leaf of that plant, crush it, and put it in my nose, it would clear my sinuses. A friend reached up with a long stick and managed to break off a leaf of the plant. It felt as I knew it would. It smelled as I knew it would. I put it to my nose. It cleared my sinuses, as I knew it would. The plant, I later learned, is a species of wild oregano, and Hawaiians know it for its medicinal properties. Another time, in the mountains of Luzon in the Philippines, walking from one Igorot village to the next with 2 Igorot guides, I slipped perhaps 30 feet down a very steep slope of scree and badly scraped the inside of both hands. I knew that I had better not get an infection on the inside of my hands. We were at least 2 days from civilization. I looked for water, but the landscape was dry and severe, and there was no water near us. I saw a plant that grew all around, and again I knew what the leaf of that plant would feel like: hard, harsh, and prickly. What it would taste like if I chewed it: bitter. And the knowing came in a set. I also knew what to do with these leaves. I had to chew them to make a poultice that could clean out the dirt from the many scrapes on my hands, and perhaps even disinfect the wounds. I chewed the leaves, wrapped the poultice with some other leaves, and tied the ungainly bundle to my hands with vines. In the evening, when we reached the village where we would stay for the night, I opened the bandages and found the wounds were clean and without infection. The same plant grows in Hawaii, and, of course, the Hawaiians also know it as a medicinal plant. It is of the verbena family. To me, this knowing is real. It is a fact as much as seeing it is a fact. To me, this knowing is real. It is a fact as much as seeing is a fact, or that being left-handed is real. There are times when I wish I could turn off this knowing, but humans are not like machines. It is not easy to turn off the senses, nor is it easy to turn them on. When we moved to Hawaii, after 2 years in Malaysia, I went through a long period of adjustment. The kind of openness that I had learned with the Signoi probably has survival value in a tropical jungle, but in the jungle of a modern city, it is a burden. I learned that I did not want to sense what people were feeling. It was frightening to discover how many people think nothing at all, but feel waves of anger, resentment, and bitterness, although they act as if they are deaf and blind to their own feelings. Often our environments are so full, so busy, that allowing all senses, including the knowing sense, to be open will result in overload. I am certain I am not the only one who has to turn off some senses in the supermarket or in the train station or airport. I avoid these places of howling overload if at all possible. One learns, has to learn, to shut off some senses, to protect oneself from all that noise. Chapter 16. What do those 100 men do? One day I went to a Signoi settlement deep in the mountains, a few hours' walk through the jungle. It was quite late when I reached the settlement. As usual, someone was waiting along the side of the path when I arrived. A young woman, this time, who, as had others, silently stood up and walked ahead to the little village. In the evening, when we sat around getting acquainted, someone asked, "Did you pass by that place where they are making a new road?" Yes, indeed, that was the way I had come. That is, in fact, why it had gotten so late. The men who worked there had to clear a path so that my car could pass. "Is it true," someone else asked, "that there is a machine there that does the work of 100 men?" I must have felt a sense of pride in our cleverness, our inventiveness, our machines. A machine that does the work of 100 men? Well, that describes a bulldozer. "Yes," I said, "there is such a machine there." Long silence. Then another person spoke up. "What do those 100 men do?" It was my turn to be silent. I had never considered labor-saving devices from that point of view. What did those 100 people do who were displaced by one bulldozer? I did not know. Today, the children of those 100 men probably work in an office, or they make shoes. Perhaps they made the computer I am working on now. It seems inevitable that machines will take over, or have taken over already, much of the labor that was done by people not too long ago. We do not think much about what those 100 men do. I did not know what to say. I had not thought about the 100 men. The ebb and flow of the gentle conversation around the tiny fire moved on to other subjects. We talked about a mysterious sickness, I remember, that had come to a neighboring settlement. But the thought of those 100 men, now out of work, haunts me still. What do those 100 men do? Not long after I had visited a Malay kampong. Malays are far from primitive. They accept many of the things of modern technology, although not Western culture itself. The Malay culture is coherent, complex, and complete, and is very much a part of everyone's life. Every place has its own uniqueness, but this village at first seemed so typical and so average that it was bland. Not much was going on when the driver and I arrived shortly after midday. The houses looked like much was what one would expect in this part of the country. Neglected, in need of repair, but not really decrepit yet. A few people were lounging around dreamily. A handful of children, half asleep, on the fringes of the little group of adults, sat or laid down in the dirt. Nobody showed any interest in us or even looked at us with curiosity as we came closer. No one came to greet us or to check us out. None of the children seemed awake or alert enough to even stare as children will. My driver and I were absorbed in the village's lethargy. I felt as if we were moving through thick molasses as we approached what looked like the hanging out place, located, of course, under a big tree, the coolest spot this time of day. We silently merged into midday village life, hanging out, doing nothing. We mumbled some greeting. It was peaceful, certainly. It was too hot for mosquitoes. They will come later. Flies were not flying. There was no breeze. Not a leaf was twitching. Even the spirits had gone elsewhere. An hour or so later it began to feel cooler. A few children began to fuss. They disappeared to go their own mysterious ways. A middle-aged man next to me looked up, awake enough to ask where we had come from. No one would ask what we were doing in the village. That was not the way of Malays, but it was polite to inquire where we were from, and slowly, very slowly, a conversation grew. By pleasantly cool mid-afternoon, most of the village stood around us. We had explained where we were from and in the process mentioned who we were. Now it would be their turn to tell us about themselves. First, however, someone wanted to know the latest gossip from the capital. Was it true that a famous politician had an affair with an even more famous movie star? I had a friend who goes to the kind of parties where politicians, famous movie stars, and foreigners mix, but even he would not have known whether that was just a rumor and nasty gossip at that, or whether there was truth to the story. Was it true, someone else asked, that the Prime Minister had gone on an extended visit to Europe and would visit the Queen? Yes, we assured them that was definitely true. In fact, the Prime Minister had already met with the Queen. The story with their picture was in all the papers this morning. Sigh of wonder wafted over the group. Ah, there almost certainly was at least one transistor radio in this village. A few people probably could read the papers, but it would take a few days for newspapers to reach them. This was a poor village off the beaten track, but they knew what was happening in the capital. Few of the villagers were wearing traditional dress, although all of them wore sarongs, faded and threadbare as they might be. But there were also nylon shirts, some watches, even costume jewelry, and a hat that looked as if it had gone through at least one war. There was not much to tell about the village, it seemed. They were just ordinary people, and not much happened here. The only thing that might be different in this village was that an inventor lived here. Someone had invented a machine, they told us, and he lives right in the village. They said the word in English, ma-tachin, adding a T to make the word sound more explosive, more aggressive. There were probably not more than 15 adults standing around, and I could not imagine any of them having invented a machine. No, a woman who stood at the back said, he is not here. He does not leave his house very often. He is a recluse. Another voice added, and he cannot hear, nor can he talk. We all moved to visit this inventor, who was a recluse and a deaf mute. He lived in what was most certainly the smallest and shabbiest house in the village. His wife met us standing in front of the door to make clear that we were not welcome inside. The house was so small that we probably could not have stood up inside. She motioned for us to go next door to a small barn-like structure. She was not deaf, and she could speak, we learned later, but perhaps living with a deaf-mute husband had made her silent as well. It was getting close to sunset, and what light came into the barn came through the door and a few chinks in the walls. In the gloom, we saw a structure of heavy beams and pulleys. The inventor stood aside to let us in, eyes downcast. He was a slight man, unusually thin even for someone in a poor village, as if he had been hungry for a very long time. He quickly motioned to his wife and made some signs to a few other women who were edging into the small space. Some of the women left. I could not imagine what the machine would do, but it looked competent, strong, simple, almost new. The wood had not yet discolored, and although in places it had worn smooth or had been perhaps polished, the place was dark and parts of the machinery were behind a partition. When I studied the machine, I saw pulleys, stout senet or coconut fiber ropes connecting a heavy beam of wood to heavy bamboo supports. I still could not imagine what the machine would do or what it was for. By now, most of the villagers had come and were standing outside, waiting for the show to begin. There was some mumbling and a bit of confusion when the inventor gave more hand signs and a few more women disappeared. Maybe 10 minutes later, it was dark now. Little oil lamps had been brought to light up the inside of the barn, and the women returned, single file, each with a handful of unhulled rice. Now I understood what the machine would do. The inventor had invented a mill. Traditionally, each household hulls rice once a day. Without refrigeration, food does not keep well in the hot, humid tropics. Raw, unhulled rice keeps better than rice that is hulled and ready to cook. A block of wood with a cup-shaped depression holds some of the unhulled rice. The pestle is a long wooden pole that pounds the hulls off the rice. 2, sometimes 3 women or girls take turns lifting the pole and letting it fall into the mortar, sometimes with some force. It is an ancient ritual. The movements of lifting and dropping are done with the whole body. Pounding rice almost looks like a dance. The pestle bonging into the mortar makes a wonderfully syncopated rhythm that fits the dance of the women, who often sing to accompany themselves. They obviously did not dislike this work. They usually smiled and laughed while lifting and letting fall the long pole. I had thought of it as woman's work, just as getting water from the river, or perhaps from a standpipe, was woman's work, accompanied by much giggling and gossip sharing. The mortar in the barn was considerably larger than those used by a household. The depression might hold as much as 6 or 7 cups of rice. The pestle was large beam I had seen sticking up into the dark recesses under the roof. Its bottom end was rounded and smooth, and thicker and much heavier than the poles used for one household. The inventor stepped on a treadle, and slowly the machine came to life. It took a few minutes to get the pestle to move up and fall down, but when its rhythm had been established, it became clear that one rather scrawny man could hull, in a few minutes, all the rice of 5 or 6 families would ever need for a meal. The demonstration lasted no longer than 5 minutes. The inventor proudly showed us the small bucketful of smoothly hulled rice, visibly cleaner, smoother, and whiter than ordinary village rice. I knew that it would take 5 or 6 households half an hour to hull that much rice, yet this had been hulled in just a few minutes. The onlookers waited for our comments. We oohed and awed and exclaimed what a wonderful machine this was, wondering meanwhile why it was so obviously unused. The villagers were proud of the inventor in their midst, but they did not use his invention. Here was a genuine native genius at work, a labor-saving device invented by a simple, almost certainly illiterate villager. Even from this simple demonstration, it was clear that this slight man could easily have hulled all the rice needed each day for the whole village in less than half an hour a day. That would leave all the women and girls who now did their daily rice pounding dance with nothing to do but... Obviously, the women did not think of hulling rice as a chore, as hard, or even unpleasant work. Perhaps it was something they looked forward to doing. It was part of the daily rhythm of life. Nobody in the village seemed to work hard or to work long hours, except perhaps during the short, intense days of planting and harvesting rice. The activities that kept the people in the village alive, getting firewood for a little cooking, hulling rice, planting, tending the rice fields, fishing occasionally, growing some vegetables, all these were not thought of as work. It was what they did each day. Together, these activities made the rhythm of their lives a pleasant routine, essentially unchanged for many generations. They felt no need to change. As I walked outside, I asked the inventor's wife whether the inventor had seen pictures of a similar machine in a book. She obviously did not know what I was talking about. I doubted that she or he had ever seen a book with schematic drawings of anything like that mill. So I asked her how he had thought of making his machine. She paused for a moment, and then she went inside the little house and came back out with 2 handfuls of crude models made of pieces of bamboo, twigs, and string, each mounted on a piece of cardboard. The inventor had invented by making and trying out scaled-down models. He had discovered the principle of moving a large upright beam with small force. The models looked childishly crude compared to the finished product. It was hard to imagine that the models would work, but the finished product certainly did. It was quite dark when we walked back to the car, followed by the adults and many of the children. They asked again how we liked the demonstration. Was this not a wonderful invention? Yes, we agreed. It was indeed a wonderful invention. The fact that it was not used obviously did not lessen its value to them. The villagers perhaps thought of the inventor and his invention as we might think of an artist and his art. Not useful, but something to be proud of, something we might display in a museum. One day, we may put our bulldozers in museums. Chapter 17. We take care of each other. Shortly before leaving Malaysia, I was asked to meet with a visiting psychologist. He had been told to talk with me, he said. Perhaps I could explain something that baffled him. He had been taken to see one of the 2 mental hospitals in Malaysia and had been told that there was not a single Malay patient. There were a large number of Chinese, a few Indians from India, Pakistan, or Ceylon, but all of them were referred to as Indian at that time. Perhaps even a few white people, but no Malays. When Malays make up half the population of this country, he said with anger in his voice, then it is impossible that there would be no mentally ill Malays. And what makes it all the more unacceptable, he added, is that in the other mental hospital it is the same. No Malays. What is going on? He wanted to know. From his manner, I could tell that he was almost convinced that it was some sort of a conspiracy. From his point of view, it seemed impossible, unthinkable, that a population of several million people did not have a single crazy person, angry person, dangerous person, who should be locked away in a mental hospital. I suggested we visit some Malay villages. By that time, I knew the country fairly well. I had visited many Malay villages, and I knew where we would be welcomed and where we could easily talk with people. I doubt that there is any culture anywhere that does not have a certain amount of shyness about letting strangers in on their most frightening psychological conditions. Mental illness is not something you can discuss easily on a first visit, but I felt certain the villagers I knew would be willing to at least talk with us. The same driver who had taken me around many times before agreed to drive us. The visitor and I sat in the back talking psychology. He said he had heard that I had made a sort of study of the Malays. Yes, but my study was really about dietary behavior, and my own interest was in healing systems, healers, and the many issues around what we would call medical services. But I felt I knew the Malays fairly well. After all, I grew up a few hundred miles from here among other Malays in Indonesia. And yes, I was a psychologist. We discussed at length what I thought were the central values of Malay culture. I remember trying to explain the word halus and kasar. Kasar means crude, rough, loud, and sensitive. And, the driver added, thick, curly, or kinky hair, the kind of hair that feels like steel wool. I continued, halus means soft, gentle, polite. Here the driver turned back again and with a smile added, it also means soft, straight hair, Malay hair. Halus, I said, is what the culture says all Malays are or should be. Kasar is what foreigners are. Loud Chinese, ruthless white people, crude Indians. Once more the driver turned around. He asked me, "What about the Orang Asli, the Aborigines? They sometimes have curly or even kinky hair. Are they Kasar?" "You know very well they are the essence of Hollis," I could not help saying. "Yes," he mused, "that is true. Maybe that means they are the old Malays. Do you think that is possible?" There was indeed one group of Aborigines whom anthropologists and government officials called Proto-Malays, supposedly the stock from which Malays evolved. The Signoi, the only group of Aborigines I knew, had sometimes intermarried with Malays, but they had a different culture, although in this case they certainly had similar values. It was true that Malays were told from earliest childhood that to be Malay is to be Hollis. Malays do not raise their voices. The driver could not help another interruption. "Yes," he said, "and that is true in the kampong. But in the city it is getting very difficult to be Malay when all around you there are Kafirs, unbelievers, who are Kasar." I hoped the visitor could sort out our discussion, which was held in Malay, with the driver in English, and with the visitor. I visited 2 villages that day, spending time being introduced to the head of the village, to some of the elders, and, as the visitor called them, older people who happened to be around. We walked here and there. We talked with children. We admired the rice fields. We were served sweet tea in a community shelter in one village, very sweet lemonade in the next. The visitor asked some pointed questions, but nobody had ever heard of a person who had been crazy or dangerous or mentally ill. The next day we visited 3 villages, the last one quite far away. We did a lot of driving that day. The second village, however, began to provide an answer to the question the visitor had asked. It was the middle of the day, a time when nobody moves, let alone works, if it can be avoided. We stood around under a large tree, trying to catch a little breeze. Our discussion with the elders was leisurely and vague. From one corner of my eye, I saw someone flitting from one tree to another, obviously trying to hide. I looked again, but did not see anything more. Then again I saw someone, a man I thought, flitting from one hiding place to another. The visitor, too, had noticed. We asked why anyone at this time of day would run from one hiding place to another. Whom was he hiding from? "Oh," someone said quite nonchalantly, "that's our thief." We said, "Your thief?" "Yes, he likes to steal things." "Did you call the police?" "No, of course not. Why should we? He's one of us. He lives in this kampong." That was the end of the discussion. A week later, the visitor joined us again for a last trip to a village even further away. This time, as soon as we arrived, we were dogged by an old woman, bent with age, but spry and very active, almost hyperactive. She had strange mannerisms. She mumbled, and every now and then she would scream out what sounded like curses, and then she would shuffle closer to us and cackle like a madwoman. Nobody in the village took much notice of her, except once when she wanted to touch the visitor's camera. One of the men called her by name, took her elbow, and said, "Come now, Grandma, do not bother us. We are talking." She wandered away, mumbling, screeching every now and then, until she disappeared, and we could not hear her any more. The visitor asked what was wrong with the woman. "Oh, nothing," everyone assured us. "That is just what she does. It does not bother anyone." It would not occur to Malays to have this woman committed to a mental hospital. After all, she was part of the village. She is one of us. Nor would it occur to the Malays to have the police come and take the thief away. He, too, is one of us. That was why there were no Malays in the 2 mental hospitals. Well, how about violent behavior? The visitor wanted to know. Are there not dangerous people in your kampongs? No, everyone was quite sure that there were no dangerous people. Well, how about that woman? He persisted. She yells and curses. Does she not sometimes strike out at someone? It was difficult to phrase in a conventional sentence in Malay, but even with a great deal of explaining, the people in this kampong were quite sure that the woman had never struck at anyone. Not even a dog? The visitor wanted to know. No, not even a dog. Driving back, the visitor grumbled. He was sure they and we were hiding something. There must be violence, he said. Maybe not often, but sometimes. I mentioned that the only cultural expression of violence in Malay culture is amok, a word that has become synonymous in many other languages with rage, even uncontrollable rage. Amok, however, is extremely rare. Someone who goes amok loses control over his actions. He, usually male, although not necessarily, takes whatever weapon comes to hand, usually a parang, and blindly mows around him, slashing at people, houses, animals, trees, anything that is in his path. Malays say he is blind. Mata galap literally means eyes in darkness. He cannot even see where he is going. He weaves like a drunk. Sometimes he falls. He stumbles over pebbles. Well, what do people do with a person who has gone amok? The visitor wanted to know. Oh, the driver turned to us again. Oh, it is dangerous to come too close in the beginning of his amok, so people run away. Later, they always catch him. And then? The psychologist asked. Do they punish him? No, they would not punish him. Why would they punish him for being blind? The driver said that he had not heard of an amok in many years. But today, he added, almost sadly, the police will probably catch him and then he would go to jail. The psychologist wanted to know whether there were any programs to treat amok or other mental illnesses, or perhaps there is even prevention. No, not that we knew. Malays keep their mentally ill to themselves, and they did not think of them as ill. Some people behave one way, others behave differently, but they are all people of our kampong. Afterword. No truth can make another truth untrue. All knowledge is part of the whole knowledge. Once you have seen the larger pattern, you cannot go back to seeing the part as the whole. Ursula K. Le Guin, from 4 Ways to Forgiveness. I consider myself fortunate indeed to have spent the first 20-some years of my life in countries where more than one language was spoken, none of them English. From the first time when I first learned to talk, I knew that some people in my environment not only spoke different words, but they also used words differently. As I learned 2 languages simultaneously, nobody told me that I must speak one language to my parents and another to other people. As all children do, I knew without having to be told. Children learn a language not from a book or even from a teacher, but from their need to communicate. Learning 2 languages, especially when they are very different, made me learn 2 words for the same thing, but more often 2 different ways to talk about what only seemed to be the same thing. One language fitted the way my parents and the other Westerners saw the world. Another language fitted the different way the people of the country saw their world. That was never remarkable to me when I was a child. Today, I realize that untaught learning was a great gift. It's quite unremarkable to me now to know that any language expresses a unique way of knowing. We in the West know our world from seeing, hearing, and measuring what we assume to be a complex thing with many parts. We rarely use any of the other 5 senses we recognize to know reality. In other areas of the world, people know from experiencing their world as a living, organic whole, where everything relates to everything and where we blend in as but another part of that whole. That experience is not seeing or hearing or measuring. It is a direct experiencing of all that we are. Naturally, Western languages express a Western view of reality. Westerners think of their language too as a thing, a container of words and meanings in which the words are parts and grammar defines and determines the relationship between words. In other parts of the world, a language is thought of to be the voice of the organism that is the whole, as birdsong is, or the roar of a waterfall. Those languages often have, at least had, no written form and therefore no officially fixed grammar. Such aspects of language as word order and function of verbs and the kind and number of relationships that are recognized, and even the tone in which a certain sound is produced, can be much more flexible, fluent, and free. To us, such a language may seem poetic because we associate poetry with a differently structured use of words. Knowing the different feelings of languages so obviously related to different views of reality has made it easier for me to understand and appreciate people who have very different points of view, which means different assumptions about what is good and what is proper, and particularly different assumptions of what is. The stories in this book are about people who have worldviews different from the Western one. They know their world differently. We do not question that a hospital is the right place to take a seriously ill patient. For people who think about illness and even death differently from the way we do, the Western way of thinking about illnesses and death may be very difficult to accept. That it is not heartless or stupid. It is simply another way of thinking about important events in life. Different values are not wrong. They're just different. The way people perceive and structure their realities expressed in their language is difficult to convey the depth and the feel of one language in the words of another. The dialogues in these stories are written in English, but they were spoken in Malay, Signoi, or Dutch, and some other languages as well. They may even have been spoken in a kind of English that most Americans might not easily recognize as English. My translation into English words and the English sentence structure can only clumsily represent another view of reality. Even though I may have known when I grew up, I am deeply grateful to the friends in many parts of the world who helped me regain that core of my being, the knowing that I am an inseparable part of this earth. Again, I feel one with the plants and the animals, the sun and the moon. Atoms of my body were once part of a bird, a lava rock, or water before I get to use them. My spirit is fed by tiger, by a tree, an orange-violet sunrise over the Pacific, the power of a storm. I sense your pain and your joy because they are mine as well. I do not believe this. I did not choose this. I know it as a given. Deep inside, I always knew, but so much that I learned smothered that knowing. The friends of these stories helped me recover my heritage. A few years ago, a friend of the family and I spent a day at the beach in Kona on the big island of Hawaii. As we were slowly crossing a very rocky area on the way to the beach, one step at a time for fear of sliding or falling, I picked up a perfect whole cowrie shell. Cowries are not rare, but a whole cowrie shell without holes or scrapes is. This one was at least 2 inches across and did not seem to have a blemish. I carried the shell with me to the beach, where we sat down and spent a long day talking. I caressed the shell as we talked, my fingers memorizing its wonderfully complex curves, my eyes imprinting its subtle colors. Gunga probably did most of the talking. He often does. Gunga, not his name, but what we call him, is almost pure Hawaiian. He has little education and cannot read or write. He is fiercely proud of his heritage, and, as do most Hawaiians, he loves the land, the Aianina, which means much more than land. Aianina also means something like home or life giver, the ground of one's existence. He and his extended family once owned the land they lived on and from, but through trickery, misunderstandings, and various other ploys that are legal in our Western system of justice, they no longer own much of anything, least of all the land. When we were ready to go home, I carefully put the shell back among the rocks close to where I had found it. Gunga stopped in his tracks and said with surprise, "Ah, you know Haoli, white person. Haoli always want to own everything they see or touch." He shook his head, mumbling all the way back to the car. "Boy, he know Haoli, putting that shell back on the beach. He know Haoli." The cowrie shell is precious in its own setting. Apart from the ocean, the beach, the sun, the shell is but a thing. For a long time, I cherished in my heart the stories collected in this book because I feared what would happen if they were taken out of context, like a shell taken away from the ocean and the sun. It is difficult for Westerners to accept that people and their words are inseparable. Now all ancient worlds are threatened by our greed, our machines, our civilization. A young Sonoy man told me the people are dying out. Others have told me they have no place to run to anymore. As Hawaiians say, "Ha'aina ma'ai ke puana," let the story be told. A friend said to me, "You were lucky. You had an unusual childhood." In many ways, my childhood was much like the childhood of a great majority of people in this world. My friend's childhood, growing up in America, was more unusual than mine. I grew up in a world and at a time when people touched each other, when we knew animals and plants intimately. It was only later, when I lived in the Western world and became educated and lived through a war, that I began to feel alienated from the earth and from my fellow humans. I was told to be in charge of my life rather than live it. I must fight to survive, they assured me. They said the world is a jungle. But when again I knew the jungle, I knew that the jungle of wild life is not at all like the jungle of Western civilization, and certainly not as dangerous. For many years, I had to work so hard to do the things I was supposed to do that I became deaf and blind to what is important inside me. My luck was to find people who were human in an ancient way. My luck was to recognize and reclaim a humanity rooted in the earth. All who are in touch with the natural world can sense energies, emotions, and intentions of people and animals. If we listen, we can know. All we need to do is give up being in charge. Knowing inside is not something unusual. It is how we are. All humans can have that connection with all that is. The connection is within us. May these stories help others remember. Volcano, Hawaii, 2001. Thank you for joining me for this book, Original Wisdom by Robert Wolff. Today is March 11th that I finished reading the story, though you all will be hearing it on the 11th of May. Tonight will be in the 20s, 26 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 3.3 Celsius. I do not know what the weather will be like in May, so I am uncertain yet if I will read another story. Some of my subscribers have inquired if I might, since they've been enjoying these evenings by the wood stove. Obviously, it will be too warm in May, or one thinks it would be too warm in May to be reading by a wood stove. So if I can find a sheltered space outside in the afternoon, I may find another book to read with you all. And if not, I will pick this up again in the autumn when the days get cold. Thanks again for joining me. See you all in the next video. Till then.